Hello, everybody. I'm Felix Wemheuer. I'm professor for modern China studies at the University of Cologne, and this is my YouTube channel, Studying Maoist China. And I'm happy to have a guest here the second time. It's Ying. Hi.
Hi, hello. Hi, Felix. Good to
Hi.
see you.
Yeah. So Ying is an associate professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Culture at Columbia University in New York. And this is the second part. We will discuss her book again. It's called Revolutionary Becomings, Documentary Media in 20th Century China. It came out with Columbia University Press this year, and this is a channel on Maoist China. So the last time we talked about the earlier period. So today there will be a focus on the documentary in a PRC. And last time we talked about several issues like the relations between war, revolution, and documentary, starting from her Qinghai Revolution of 1911. And we also discussed foreign influences on Chinese documentary from Europe, the Soviet Union, or Japan. And some questions are also in the whole book. Should a documentary be authentic and reflect reality, or is this useful to add some stage scenes, for example, to present a higher truth to the audience? Yeah, if you are interested, you can watch the first part of the interview. So now we will start to talk about Maoist China. So how did the conditions for production change over time in Maoist China? What was the impact of the Sino-Soviet split in the early 1960s, or also the Great Leap Forward in the late 1960s on documentaries?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Felix, for doing another interview with me on the Maoist period. So in the Maoist period, in previous interviews, in the previous interview, I talked about how documentary production relies on infrastructure, and Chinese filmmakers in semi-colonial Shanghai and also during the war did not have adequate infrastructure to access documentary locations, and so over the years of the war, documentary production gained more and more infrastructural support by the nationalist government, even though this was also the wartime, so a lot of this was very unstable and can be easily disrupted. So during the Maoist period, we see that infrastructure for documentary production became much more strengthened. So in Beijing, we have the Central Newsreel and Documentary Film Studio, and they would have correspondents stationed in each province and working also often with the Xinhua She and the news outlets in each province, and they could respond to events happening on the ground very rapidly. And then the editing was centralized in Beijing. So the filmmakers would send in footage and it will be then compiled and edited in Beijing. So there was a great deal of party supervision, on how the stories are told and framed, and what are the stories to be included. So documentary engaged with, earlier we also talked about these different issues and war, propaganda, in which documentary played an important role. Documentary's engagement in the Maoist period, in the book, talked about the two major problems China faced in the Maoist period and how documentary engaged with them. The first is the problem of time, how to industrialize quickly, which we see that in the Great Leap Forward, and also the problem of space, how to navigate the shifting waters of Cold War geopolitics. And I deal with that with films made on diplomacy, which we'll talk about later. So during the Great Leap Forward, cinema output and exhibition grew rapidly, just like the rest of the industrial and agricultural production, or at least on paper. And documentary was the mode of cinema that experienced the biggest growth. And these are for a number of reasons. One reason is documentary can be produced very fast, and it can be made and distributed by projectionists, all over the country and shown to massive audiences in factories and in countryside and in open air construction sites. Another reason was for documentaries' rapid growth more than any other major genres, is that it was made collaboratively. We know that since the early 1950s, feature film production had been heavily regulated by the state and watched, for its political correctness. And so there was also the anti-rightist campaign right before the Great Leap Forward. So filmmakers found it difficult to make politically correct feature films, which involved a lot of scripting. But documentary was collaborated with model workers and so basically the masses, and that was considered more politically safe. So the Sino-Soviet split, which you also mentioned in your question, didn't happen yet then, but already China was seeking, there was already a rift, right? China was seeking its own model of fast industrialization, even though Soviet Union didn't approve of it. So the documentary during the Great Leap Forward also exhibited a fascinating combination of conventional practices of industrial and educational films and experimental practices of documenting tomorrow, for example, which brought in futuristic elements and even sci-fi into documentary texts. So, on the industrial and educational film side, films used in industry wasn't new. I wrote about Taylorism and the early 20th century, how moving images were used in Taylorist scientific management to optimize work routines. In the Great Leap Forward, we have tens of millions of rural inhabitants came to the city and became new industrial workers, and even more were mobilized to build rural infrastructures such as reservoirs and other infrastructure. So industrial documentaries showcased optimal work routines, much like in early 20th century. They also inculcated time discipline among new industrial workers and urged workers to improve their unit time productivity. Another innovation relating to creating a very fast-paced industrialization was the practice of documenting tomorrow. It was made possible by a new mode of documentary film called artistic documentary that allowed reenactments and fictionalization. And so what we talked about before came into intense view here. And so in one film that I wrote about, The Caprice of the Ming Tong Reservoir, combined historical drama, documentary, musical, and sci-fi all in one film. And I, one thing we need to take note is that Great Leap Forward was highly experimental. So a lot of the infrastructural projects, such as the reservoirs, were actually, we all know, like historians know, very contested on the ground because they aimed at drastic and unprecedented transformations of the local environment where, people lived and worked for ages, right? And so these projects also received very little capital investment from the state. And so they relied on back-breaking work by the rural masses, right? Over a sort of 24/7 work schedule. And so these became very contested on the ground, of course. And so documenting tomorrow, I show that by bringing in demonstrative benefits into view, they contributed to a media ecology of optimism in the Great Leap Forward that attempted to dispel doubts and create an illusion of risk-free innovation and development.
I like to ask you a question. So first, what is a sci-fi? Maybe the non-media audience don't know it. And the other question I like to ask is, you talk about that these films were made to educate, for example, peasants to use new technologies or to enforce labor discipline. And we know that in the late Cultural Revolution, there already had then cinema screenings in villages. But I don't know how it was in the late 1950s, early 1960s, for example, in this construction site or villages where there any equipment available. I think many villages had no electricity around that time. So was there a big impact really on like working practices of the masses at that time already?
Yes, yes. No, in late 1950s, especially with the onset of the Great Leap Forward, film projection also increased, tens and hundreds of folds. I actually have the data in the film in my book. So these and Jay Lee has also written about film projectionists, and Chen Shuzhou has also written. But in this period already, film was shown in major like construction sites. You have films shown even during daylight. So daylight film technology, where you could, I mean, the screen and the projector, and there is also kind of a roof on top of a screen. These were developed in order to show films during daylight as people were working. So if we think about, film's position in capitalist economies, right? The early cinema was a way for labor, for workers to rest and to innovate. In the Great Leap Forward, we actually see films used very closely with industrial sites. Also, factory films and these optimal work routines and standardization of work routines. These were shown in urban settings with the union, and actually the union also competed with projectionists in hosting film exhibitions, because there's also an economy, right? You get some ticket sales from these films. So definitely film was already, and also about the dissemination of technology. The backyard, so I wrote in the book about filmmakers in 1958 getting the task of making quite a lot of small, short educational films on how to build backyard furnaces, how to actually look for mineral, for raw mineral deposits in your neighborhood, and then how you can excavate them, how you can break these stones basically down, and then make them, and then make iron and steel and other metal works from backyard furnaces. And so these were given, these were shown along also with other graphic, diagrams and, visual manuals, right? Because for this kind of technology to circulate in the country with a lot of, people in the rural areas not actually literate or unable to read the industrial manuals, these films also provided a lot of support in that way.
Like TikTok today, when people want to build some furniture, they will look for short clips. But let you ask here, for my research in a Great Leap Forward, I know there were many projects in 58 when the leap started, like the nurseries, public dining halls, all kind of experiments. But when the famine then started in 59, right, then many of these projects were scaled down or disappeared. And for example, when you just look at the quality of paper, like of archival documents, you can see, for example, then in the year of the famine in 60 and 61, the paper has a very low quality. So had this kind of change from this enthusiastic Great Leap at 58 then to the famine also an impact on the documentaries that you can see?
Yes. So, I mean, first of all, the educational documentaries I talked about, on backyard furnaces. These were, I mean, there are production records. These were made in very short time. So even, the films, they don't look well put together because they were made in very short time. But these were made in 58 and 59. But in 1960, I also wrote about a number of films in 1960, and there were nurseries, and there were the film talks about how nurseries increase their scale, right? So you suddenly have double, triple of the kids coming into the nursery, and the different kinds of ways and technologies, including folded furnitures and different ways to manage the children. There were also grain stores where the grain store looked like, I mean, we didn't talk about sci-fi before, but it looked very scientific, like a kind of a spaceship, and then you can buy grain from there. And there's also restaurants where the servings came from railings from the ceiling, and you can automatically, I mean, it's almost like today you order by, by like an iPad or some by your phone, and then they just come, the food just came. So even in the 60s, I saw that, and because of the unevenness, right, of the country. So in the countryside, you already have the famine. But in the 60s, you still see films on restaurants and on automated restaurants, in places like Beijing. And but this is very ironic, so this whole image regime of the Great Leap Forward, I thought really obscured so much. If you look at the film scripts and then the actual film, like for example, Huang Baomei, which was made in 1958, was about the Great Leap Forward in Shanghai in like a textile company. In the film script, there were discussions on worker fatigue and on the unwillingness of workers to work during the weekend, but it's not to be found in the film.
So maybe also this futuristic films on automatic restaurants were not shown maybe also to hungry peasants, and maybe more for an urban audience, or
definitely not. Yes. So that also brings I think just the distribution of the films may not be even, and in urban China, people did not have I mean, people actually did have knowledge of famine because they had rural relatives, but the image regime in the cities would not show that. Another, you also asked about the sort of electricity in the countryside. An interesting anecdote I wrote about in the film was that so the film projectionists would bring in these electric generators, and then they would land the electric generators to explode the explosives for opening the mountains and creating, I mean, for basically the use of making reservoirs. So the electricity that brought in not only powered the films but also powered the construction.
Yes, let's move on to the Cultural Revolution. So in your book, you also have a chapter on documentaries related to diplomacy, right? The PRC was not a recognized state by many countries in the early and mid-1960s. So the state produced documentaries about state visits, also including leaders such as Mao, Zhou Enlai, and Liu Shaoqi. Also, sometimes their wives, right, were then portrayed. And I want to ask you why it was so important, this documentaries of state visit. And there's also a part in your book about Liu Shaoqi's state visit to Indonesia in 1960. Right? This was before the massacre and the genocide, and he went there with his wife Wang Guangmei, and this documentary was widely shown. But then in the Cultural Revolution, it became like an evidence for the revisionism or decadence of Liu Shaoqi and Wang Guangmei, and played a very different role. So what role does gender also play in your argument in relation to the documentaries?
Yes, no, thank you for this. So I was this film, Liu Shaoqi visits Indonesia, was what initially drew my attention to documentaries on international relations and diplomacy, and then also its use in the denunciation of the couple, and its very forensic use, right? During the Cultural Revolution, it was sort of scrutinized, and I also quote from Red Guard's newspapers about really looking at the images and finding capitalist intentions or inclinations of Wang Guangmei and Liu Shaoqi in the film itself. So that also made me think about how documentary really bridged international politics and domestic politics together. These films are important. I mean, documentary had been very widely seen. I mean, just because of the increase in film exhibition, and documentary filmmakers also moved. They are the same filmmakers, right, from the newsreel and documentaries and the Central Studio. That they were overlapping. I mean, because there was a group of filmmakers who tend to do more of the international documentary, but still it was an overlapping group that moved between the international arena and the domestic. And we all know, I think the viewers of this channel know that Maoist China, or the domestic politics is so entwined with international politics. We could not think about Maoist China without thinking about the Cold War environment. And so documentary for me then, especially this one, but then I wrote about many, including documentaries on the Korean War, and also documentaries on the Cultural Revolution and class struggle. They were, they stranded both domestic and international and brought together a set of shared figurations to talk about what revolutionary struggle meant, who was the enemy and who was the friend. And basically, that for me was very interesting to think about them together, to take this opportunity to think about them together. So I discussed, for example, how maps and diagrams were used in documentaries on the Korean War to educate viewers on China's geopolitical position. But of course, at the same time, this was also the Sanfan Wufan and the sort of elimination or the regulation of domestic sort of internal enemies, and so how these figurations actually intersected with each other, imaginations also intersected with each other. Liu Shaoqi and Wang Guangmei's visit to Indonesia happened at a time when this geopolitical mapping, which looked pretty clear at the beginning of the 1950s, became not clear. This was a time when Sino-Soviet split had already happened, disputes among the socialist bloc, and also relationships with newly independent states such as Indonesia were engulfed in shifting, Cold War politics. So, the Bandung moment sort of had, was this. And I also wrote about the Bandung moment, but by that time, there were a lot of fractures, even within the Bandung movement. And so in this very uncertain situation, gender played a very important role. So Wang Guangmei going to Indonesia as the diplomatic wife was no accident, right? Gender had always played a role in international politics. Women, because they were not in the top position of power, were considered more flexible, and they could be, unofficial mediators to mend relationships between states. So they were not, considered to be principled statesmen. So they could kind of, go to the back door and kind of mend, and smooth over differences. So in the book, I briefly traced a history of wife diplomacy in China from Song Meiling to Wang Guangmei. And so wife diplomacy was actually also recommended in 1950s by the Soviet experts, and the Chinese woman cadres were indignant about it. Why we should be this wife to accompany our husbands, on diplomatic missions. And during the early 1960s, Wang Guangmei, went. I mean, this whole film was on, even though it was on Liu Shaoqi visit. I mean, it actually says Liu Shaoqi visits Indonesia, but the limelight was completely on Wang Guangmei. And the film, in terms of its form, so it's not just the content of wife diplomacy, but its form is actually gives form to wife diplomacy as this very improvisational, open, curious, meandering, and also, intersubjective and tactile kind of representation of international relations. Wang Guangmei was, touching everything like a textile and art, and there was a lot of playfulness, and there's also, a large element of play. But at the same time, this is very, very risky, because women, as diplomatic wives, they were put in the lower position in the hierarchy, but they actually absorbed a lot of risk in liaising with, ideologically heterogeneous allies. And in the Cultural Revolution, of course, Wang Guangmei was condemned and ridiculed, and this film was, shown as evidence for her decadence and her obscenity and so on. I also observed that, documentary also during the Cultural Revolution, just as this documentary was condemned, it was also entered a crisis. It wasn't able to document people's lives because by that time class struggle had again become intensified, but it was impossible to find class markers in the society. And so documentary remediated sculptures, paintings, and basically had to borrow from other art forms that were where stereotypes were easily made easier to bring it to documentary to represent the class struggle that had been very misplaced in this period.
But I think what's quite interesting that when Nixon visited China right in 72, then also Jiang Qing played a quite of the similar role, right? She was taking Nixon's wife then to watch modern Beijing opera, and then this wife diplomacy was used again, right? And later, after the fall of Jiang Qing, she came accused that she told state secrets to foreigners because she allowed this American journalist to interview her about her life. So that, I think, is quite interesting, and this leads us to the next transition. So when Mao Zedong died, and under the leadership of Hua Guofeng and later Deng Xiaoping, so many victims of the Cultural Revolution were rehabilitated, including Liu Shaoqi, who was already dead. And then in your book, you show that documentaries are also used in this rehabilitation campaign. Could you give some examples for it? And did it work as a way of reconciliation?
Yes. Yes. So earlier in the book and also earlier in our conversation, we talked about how documentary played very important roles in the revolutionary process from the Xinhai Revolution onwards. But when we get to the years after Cultural Revolution, it also became a very important media for parties' rehabilitation efforts to, correct past wrongs. So every rehabilitation, major ones of fallen cadres, including Liu Shaoqi, led to filmmaking, and these films were called to give form to rehabilitation, 使平反形象化, right? So in 1980, for example, Liu Shaoqi's rehabilitation ceremony was broadcasted by television, but also printed on film to circulate to cinemas and countryside. So typically, a rehabilitated cadre would have two films made about them, so about him. So one, it will be the rehabilitation ceremony itself, and the other would be a biographical film, which would recount, his revolutionary past, and which would also use a lot of the archival footage. And this, so this also brought archival footage back into circulation. Another development was the Gang of Four, the trial of the Gang of Four, which was also broadcasted on television in 1980 and also circulated in the same way on film to the countryside where there's no TV coverage. So that trial also involved examination of audiovisual evidences in the trial in the courtroom itself, but also the trial had been documented, including sending including interactions with the Gan for and the Jiangqing, and also the court proceedings, and so these also so these these representations of the rehabilitation and also of transitional justice, even though it's also we know that it's also a show trial, but the show trial needed to be seen, right? And film was very much an important media for that.
I think what's very interesting, right, that in the beginning there was a live broadcast of the trial on television, right? This may be very different from the past, and then because Jiangqing defended herself instead of accepting guilt, right, that they stopped the live broadcast, right?
Yes. No, actually, I could not find these live broadcasts, which yes, like they actually broadcasted live, these sessions, and of course I couldn't find them now. What I found was just like a film about the trial, and especially about the end of the trial when the verdicts were given. But definitely there were live broadcasts, and you could also see that sort of atmosphere of openness in early early sort of post-Mao periods, but then very quickly you also see that tension. Very quickly the books are supposed to be closed, and the democracy war was already happening then, so we needed to move on and close the books, and you see that tension definitely.
Yeah, I was in China when there was a trial against Bo Xilai, and then some people said, oh, the trial against the Gang of Four was broadcasted live, at least for a while, but not that about Bo Xilai, where you had very few footage just shown on television. So this is a last question I like to ask. So your book is about a revolutionary documentary, and then you also show that in the 1980s there were also many documentaries, but with a different focus. For example, He Shang, with a focus more on economic development and other topics. So did a revolutionary documentary die in China with the decline of Maoism in the 1980s?
Yeah, so let me just first say a few things about He Shang, because I ended chapter 6, on the rehabilitation and reorientation, historiographical reorientation with river allergy, because I felt like river allergy, it of course its messages are very problematic. It pits, some Chinese yellow civilization, continental civilization with Western oceanic civilization, and all of this historical analysis, of course, had been critiqued. But what was interesting about He Shang is that it brought together a number of developments, developments in television, which was, conceived to be a more democratic and more interactional medium to mend party-people relations, or mend bureaucracy and people relations. And then there's also, the use of archival footage. It was very interesting for me to write the last chapter, because a lot of the archival footage that I wrote about, or the footage I wrote about in early chapters in the book came back, and they again also with international footage, because that time television had already collaborated with international television and other news outlets to bring more international so audio-visual footage into Chinese television. So you see that there is, through these audio-visual images and recombination of them, that you see a change in historiography. And so He Shang, very much relied on these audio-visual images. What it did, though, was that instead of earlier television documentaries that were very chatty and that brought in a lot of voices from the grassroots. So there were spontaneous interviews on the street. There was also, sort of correspondence with viewers and reading it out, and then questioning the government officials about the viewers' opinions and their grievances. And so there was a lot of these kind of multivocal and interactive practice. There is one documentary series on the Grand Canal, which really pit television as almost the Grand Canal, that infrastructure, moving between the center and the rest of the country. But River Elegy actually became again authoritative. It interviewed mostly intellectuals, and so this was when the intellectuals again came into taking command of the newest media of television, and they were in a powerful position. They were allied with the reform, sort of factions in the government, and also a lot of the think tanks that associated with reform policy design. And so intellectuals, for me, He Shang really showed how intellectuals in China had always been interested in grasping the newest media technology and put their footprint in, their vanguardism, right, in terms of directing the country's the unfolding of the country's development or transformation. But in terms of kind of revolutionary documentary and did the revolutionary documentary die, after Maoism? I think that Maoism doesn't define Chinese revolution. I mean, over the 20th century, we see so many different articulations of revolutionary, visions. When we say revolution, we mean kind of the radical, radically transforming the society for a better outcome. And we see many different kinds of visions. So Maoism was a dominant one, but even in the 1980s and 1990s and onwards, we see progressive filmmaking that raise questions and also try to build reflexivity, critique towards the dominant, especially after the marketization and the sort of intensification of capital accumulation and capitalism in China. So you see that throughout. So I don't think I think progressive filmmaking had existed 20th century and also now.
But it seems to me that also in the 1920s and 1930s in the Republican area, this documentary production was also closely linked to the state and the government, where when you talk about the 1990s or 2000s, then these new techniques came available, right, where everyone can make a documentary, if you want to call it, with a smartphone or with a video camera.
Yeah, so in the 20s and 30s, they were not so connected with the state. They were more connected with film studios trying to make news films. So film studios trying to vertically integrate and make news films. But after the war, so starting from the war period, it's more connected to the state. But also, you are right. Actually, in the 20s, they were connected to party politics, to partisan politics, and to the military, like to the warlords and so on. So I did make an argument in the epilogue of the book when I talk about independent documentary and how do we see independent documentary after having gone through this whole history. And I showed that documentary in the 20th century, prior to independent documentary, had been working with power, or at least working with political actors who could gain power. And after 1989, that cut. So filmmakers realized that they, at that time, there's an exodus from state film studios and from television, because many filmmakers felt that this what they had tried to mend, the party people relationship, could not be mended. So they voluntarily left the power center. And the independent documentary then had to deal with this, how do you deal with the film legacy that had been working with the political power, but now having no political power, being very marginalized. And then, there is an ethical issue, because if you expose some social ills, you cannot actually mend it. You can't even influence public opinion, because these were not available for public, viewership. Then the ethical issue became more prominent, right? Are you just showing it in international festivals and so on? Are you just showing it to urban middle class? And what's the political valence of these? So in that sense, I completely agree with you. I also want to say one more thing about sort of the feminist critique I offered in the book, because this, has also to do with wife diplomacy. But in general, I think I also looked at documentary as both sort of classifying and making hierarchies and making exclusions, very much like how it was done throughout the period. But at the same time, you also have documentary being very attuned, being inclusive, and being kind of patiently, seeing things unfold without eagerly giving it a name or condemn it or exclude new things. So these two tendencies exist, and so they're almost this hard and soft kind of tendencies. And so a feminist critique of the Chinese Revolution would be to say that revolution should be also soft, that there should be a lot more tolerance, patience, and care, and not as quick judgments. And this had to do with revolutionary epistemology that I wrote about in the book as a center for the book.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because also in some of the Chinese Revolution, women were also among the most radical voices, like Jiang Qing or then Chiling in 89. Just to maybe to finish here, why these documentaries I think are very important from the 1990s and 2000, right? Even if they're often just shown to international audience. Because like they are like documents for the next generation to get an impression what's happened in this period. I just think a great example is Be West of the Tracks, right? I think it's a 9 hours, or it's even longer, 9 hours
yes.
documentary, how a steel district in Dongbei is just, first there's a layoff, and then it's like bulldozers destroy the working class communities, right? And now you can watch this documentary on YouTube, right? So when maybe in 10 or 20 years people will ask, or even now, what happened in the 1990s, early 2000s during the process of deindustrialization and privatization in Dongbei, right, is maybe one of the most impressive accounts we have, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the same with, early 2000s, the demolition, documentaries on urban demolition. I mean, now you go to Shanghai, I mean, you don't see any trace of it, because it's all very boutique like, and, it's all kind of facade. And now the air is very clean, so like all the dust that settled, maybe two decades ago. So yeah. Also this, what were the cost to people during that time in urban development? Also, needed. So I think documentary now it really serves this archival role.
It was my pleasure. So thanks a lot. And
thank you,
bye.
Felix. Yes, bye. Yeah.